Welcome to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of 2 books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is Pastor S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. In May of 2021, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis erupted again into violence, and for several weeks the world was treated to headlines and photographs of the brutality of the conflict. But is media coverage of the crisis that we receive here in the United States both accurate or even fair? Here to talk about this issue and other issues surrounding this conflict is Allison Weir. She is a celebrated freelance journalist and founder of If Americans Knew, which is an independent research and information institute with a particular focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. She is a sought-after speaker and lecturer on this topic, including having done briefings on Capitol Hill and the National Press Club. And she's also the author of many books and articles, including Against Our Better Judgment, The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel, which, by the way, received praise from both ends of the political spectrum. Allison Weir, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, let's go back to 2001, if we could. You were the editor of a weekly newspaper, and suddenly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict heated up again, and you decided to leave your job and travel to the West Bank and Gaza without a guide or flak jacket. And what happened, and what led you to start If Americans Knew?
Well, what happened, as you mentioned, is I was the editor of a small local newspaper, really had nothing to do with international coverage. But the Israeli-Palestinian issue suddenly became prominent because of this, the uprising called the Intifada, which just means shaking off of oppression in fall of 2000. And I got curious about that. I'd never looked into the issue before. I had a little more time. My youngest child had just gone to college, which is a transition point. Mm-hmm. So I began to really follow the news coverage of it, something I had not done before. And when I did that, I noticed that it was very one-sided. We were hearing about Israelis in great detail, as we should, as I wanted. But I expected also to hear from and about Palestinians. And I noticed that came much less often. So pretty soon I thought I really was not getting the full story. I was getting largely one side of the story. So because the Internet had just started and you could look into things on this new thing called the Internet, I started to do some searches on there, and I discovered that there were really very good sources from the region itself, so we could hear directly what was going on there instead of just relying on U.S. media. And I discovered that the violence was very much more one-sided than we were being led to believe, that Israeli forces were shooting Palestinian, not, unarmed Palestinian men, women, and children, every day in very large numbers. So I just was reading those reports more and more, and after a while I felt it might be the most covered up issue I had ever seen on both sides of the political spectrum, both the liberal press and the conservative press. I felt were really just giving us Israeli-centric reporting. So I quit my job in Northern California in Sausalito, and I traveled over to the West Bank and Gaza as a freelance reporter in February and March of 2001. Just traveled around by myself, got lost occasionally, had my little notebook and camera, and I saw really, really horrific violence from Israeli forces. I went through Palestinian neighborhoods in Gaza in particular that were just bullet-riddled, that looked like, huge, huge damage throughout this Palestinian home. At times it felt like I was seeing those pictures we've seen of World War II carnage with, buildings and ruins, etc. Well, that's what I was seeing there. And I saw many children who had been shot by Israeli forces. So it was, I saw, visited children in hospitals with bullets in their backs. They'd been running away from invading Israeli soldiers. So when I got back to the United States, I decided to start an organization focused on just giving Americans the facts on this issue. Logical, it's nonpartisan, we don't use jargon, etc. It's very much a journalistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
And because I had also learned in the course of my research into this that we were giving Israel a massive amount of our tax money. This is something that at that time was really almost never reported in the U.S. media, and still is very rarely reported. But we give Israel over $10 million per day of our tax money. We have given Israel, a tiny country, without any need for humanitarian help, more of our tax money than we've given any other country on earth. So I realized that Americans are very involved in this issue and responsible in a certain extent for what Israel's doing, because our tax money and our U.S. policies are enabling Israeli action. So I felt that Americans really had the need to learn what's going on over there, because the rest of the world knows that the U.S. is involved. The rest of the world, especially people in the region, are very aware that the U.S. supports Israel, that we give Israel massive amounts of money, that Israeli forces are often using American weaponry. So they're aware of, when a child is shot, that the American taxpayers have in part paid for that. Therefore, I thought it was American taxpayers to know that and to know what was going on over there.
Mm-hmm.
So I started a nonprofit organization called If Americans Knew, to just give all Americans across the political spectrum the facts on this issue and about our involvement in the issue. That's sort of the short story of how I got involved and started the organization.
And now you've also written a book, Against Our Better Judgment, which is kind of a provocative title, I guess you would say, and it deals with how the U.S. got so deeply involved in the foundation of Israel and in this conflict. How did we get so deeply mired in this conflict? Could you trace a little bit of the history for us?
Yes, I'd be glad to. What happened is, as I said, I started to wake up to this issue and look into it. I also read book after book after book. I'm somebody who reads a lot and wants to get the full information on things. So I was reading all of these really well-cited books, reliable, factual books about the history of this issue. And I learned that, I think waiting is distracting. But in all these books, I started to read a history of how the U.S. got involved that almost nobody seemed to know. So eventually I decided that I needed to write it. By that time I was writing articles about what was going on now, about the latest violence in the Palestinian territories. I was writing about what was going on in Congress now, but I really wasn't writing about the history of how we had gotten involved. And after a while I realized this was really essential information that almost no one is covering, even though it's in all of these books. So I decided I would write an article about it. But fairly soon I realized I just couldn't cover it in an article, so I ended up writing this book. What I discovered is that the lobby on behalf of Israel began in the United States in the late 1800s. This is far earlier than I had expected and far earlier than most people know. That already in the late 1800s, there were numerous organizations that were working to create a Jewish state in Palestine. Keep in mind that at that time, Palestine, as it was called, there was a region under in the late 1800s, it was under the Ottoman Empire. Fairly soon it was under the British Empire. The region was already inhabited. It had a population that was about 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, and a little under 5% Jewish, all living at peace, with one another. There was not the kind of sectarian violence we see today. But what happened is there was a movement that began in Europe, and very quickly, and this is what I write about, in the United States, a movement called political Zionism that was working to create and establish a Jewish state on land in which that was already populated with a population that was 95% not Jewish. So this was, this would involve a major dispossession of most of the inhabitants of that land. So political Zionism began. There were organizations that became very influential, beginning at around 1900. By 1910, there were 20,000 Zionists in the United States. By 1920, I think it was, there were about 200,000. And they included people of substance, lawyers, business people, and they were already becoming influential in large American cities with politicians who were, of course, very eager to get financial support and political support. So they were already, this pro-Israel lobby, even before Israel existed, was already significant in the United States in the early 1900s. And yet here we have most Americans, I among them, I had never heard of political Zionism. When I talk to people and I ask, have you heard of Zionism? Do you know what it is? I find that people say what I probably would have said, which is, let me see, I think I've heard that word. What does it mean? And yet we have a political movement that's been operating in the United States for over 100 years. That's a very established movement. There are organizations. There's the World Zionist Organization. There's the American Zionist Organization. These have websites. They're fully documented. This isn't some conspiracy theory. And that most of us don't know they exist, and certainly would think that sounded like a conspiracy theory. So here we have, in the early 1900s, this movement to use the United States to create a Jewish state in Palestine. A very significant development occurred in about 1912, when a very prominent American attorney named Louis Brandeis became active. He became a Zionist. He was Jewish, but like most Jewish Americans, he was not a Zionist. Most Jewish Americans during this time felt, well, we're Americans. We're not interested in some political, non-religious ideology that says we're supposed to go in the Middle East, where I've never lived before. So the movement did not include most Jewish Americans, and Louis Brandeis was among that group. But then he was very influenced by a number of people, including some people that were sent over specifically from Europe to push this movement. He was influenced by an uncle, and he became a Zionist himself, and very soon was head of the World Zionist movement. Then he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson, and while he was in the Supreme Court, he worked on behalf of Zionism. This was really shocking to me. He's a very well-respected jurist. Many of us probably could not name many past Supreme Court justices, but Louis Brandeis is one of the ones that I think many of us have heard of and respect. And yet, he was, from his Supreme Court chambers, he was secretly running World Zionism. He was sending out directives to his loyal lieutenants about what they would do, should do to push this ideology, and they would report back to him. This is well documented. This was, if people read my book, which I hope they'll do, you'll find that literally half the book is citations. So everything that I'm saying now and that's in the book has thorough sourcing for it. This isn't the type of thing I would have even thought to make up. So this was a major part of how and why the United States got involved in Israel-Palestine, because there was a lobby within the United States that wanted us to help create a Jewish state in a land in which, there's nothing wrong with a Jewish state, except that it involved the ethnic cleansing of a region. Most of us don't feel that ethnic cleansing is proper. This was no more proper than any other case. Then, if you'd like me to go on, I can tell a little bit more about Brandeis and what went on at that point. Or
Sure. If you could talk about what happened in the 48 and so forth.
Sure. Well, again, Brandeis is very interesting, and it was significant because the subtitle to my book is Against Our Better Judgment, The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel. What happened is that, this is the sort of sensationalistic part of my book. A lot of it's surprising, but this is probably the most surprising of all, is that Brandeis was one of the leaders of a secret Zionist society called the Parashim. This is written about in a number of places. It was written about by Peter Gross, who was a New York Times diplomatic correspondent, very respected. It was written about by, mostly it was written about by an Israeli historian named Sarah Schmidt, who wrote a book that talked about the Parashim and had an article that was published in a scholarly journal in the United States. So this society was influencing U.S. policies intentionally. And also one of the members of the Parashim, the founder of it, Horace Callan, who was a professor, an American professor, put forth the proposition that the British would benefit from a declaration in support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was suggested in about 1915 by Horace Callan. And the people who have heard of the Balfour Declaration, which was a British letter from the foreign minister that opened the door for Zionism, for Jewish immigration into Palestine, will recognize what was being suggested, that the British, should support this political movement in which Zionists would colonize Palestine and take it over for a Jewish state. This was done as I said, the suggestion was made in 1915. And people might wonder, well, what would that have to do with Britain at that time? Because at that time, Palestine was not under the British Empire, it was under the Ottoman Empire. But at that time, Britain was in a war, as we'll recall, called at that time the Great War. Today, of course, we call it World War I. And they were fighting against the Ottoman Empire. So the idea was that if they defeated the Ottoman Empire, they would then be placed in charge of Palestine, which did indeed happen. At that point, they could enable Israeli Jewish colonization of Palestine. So jumping ahead, after World War I, that did happen. The British were in charge of Palestine. They did enable, off and on, Jewish colonization of Palestine. This resulted in, not surprisingly, eventually there was violence because no population wants to be pushed out. They will eventually fight back. So the indigenous Palestinian population fought against the Zionist colonists, and the Zionist colonists fought against the indigenous population. Then as now, the large proportion of people that were killed were the Palestinians. But both groups also were fighting against the British. They wanted to push out the British. And so when we jump ahead to the key point, we look at 1947, after World War II, when the British, there was so much violence going on in Palestine among these two groups and against the British, that they decided finally to just give up. Their empire was coming to an end. This was one of many places that was coming to an end. And they decided to turn the question of Palestine over to the United Nations to solve. It was the international body had placed Britain in charge of the mandate, it was called, and Britain was now turning it back over to the international community to solve. At that point, the United Nations could have affirmed its fundamental principle, which is self-determination of people. If it had done that, there could have and should have been elections by the people living on that land to form their own government and their own country. But if they had done that, the majority of the population, despite this colonization effort over decades, the Jewish population in Palestine at that time was still only 30%. And they owned only about 5 to 6% of the land. So the populations were still by far was Palestinian, a large majority. And, real fair elections would have created a Palestinian country. The Zionists were very aware of that. So instead of allowing that to happen, which is what the UN naturally should have done, they pushed through the UN a partition plan, as it's called, in which somebody else's land, Palestine, would be divided between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And the Jewish state was to have more of the land than the Palestinian state, which is bizarre, because, as I said, the Palestinians owned over 90% of it, and they were 70% of the population. So this is the partition plan that the UN proposed, the UN General Assembly. However, it has no force of law because it was never taken up by the Security Council. So some people say the UN created Israel, but it really didn't do that. It just recommended this bizarre plan. The way Israel was created is that after that plan was proposed, there was increased violence between the two groups, and beginning in about November of 1947, Israeli forces, they weren't yet Israeli in a few months, they became Israeli at this point, they were pre-Israeli forces, began pushing out large numbers of Palestinians, committing numerous massacres of Palestinian villagers, and they eventually, in May of 1948, declared the State of Israel, and that's when Israel was created, through what a major historian in Israel, an Israeli historian named Ilan Pappé, has written a book about that time, one of several books. The book is entitled The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, because that is how Israel was created, was established, through a war of ethnic cleansing. So that's how Israel began.
What you've started this organization that has a great informative website, If Americans Knew. What would you say were the maybe top 2 issues that you find Americans are the most uninformed or underinformed about when it comes to this conflict?
I would say, first of all, most Americans aren't really aware that we are involved in it. They tend to think, well, this is one of those distant, confusing, sad conflicts or issues, but it has nothing to do with me. I have Jewish friends I know that like to visit Israel periodically. So most Americans, if they're not Jewish or Palestinian, and most of us are not, just tend to think this is a distant, confusing issue that doesn't involve us, which is untrue because it's our tax money that Israel's using. The second thing they often, almost always don't know, is what's actually going on in the region. Often they're very unaware of the fact that it is Israelis that are doing most of the violence, that the violence is almost in these periodic eruptions of violence. It's almost every time Israel that has initiated the violence. They're unaware that Palestinians are being killed in far greater numbers than Israelis. Now, again, what we think we know about issues depends on the media that we use. Which news media? Do we read the New York Times and listen to NPR, or do we go to the Wall Street Journal and watch Fox News? So if you're among the population that goes to what the liberal media, the New York Times, NPR, PBS, that coverage is still very Israel-centric. I've done a number of studies on this and articles on it. Still very much Israel-centric. But it does now give the impression, I think, to people that, well, they're sort of wrong on both sides, and both sides are at times committing violence. if you go to the conservative media, like Fox News, you tend to think, oh, it's the Palestinians are committing all the violence. It's, Palestinians are terrorists, and that's where the violence comes from, and poor Israel is just defending itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some conservative media, American Conservative Magazine, for example, that's quite well informed on this issue, but that has a very small readership.
Mm-hmm.
So most people don't know what's actually going on the ground there. They're often led to think either it's just both sides are doing wrong, or that it's Palestinians that are doing wrong. And they're not aware of the extent to which Israeli forces, most people probably don't know in the past week, Israeli forces killed in 4 unarmed Palestinian civilians, 2 of them children, one of them a 20-year-old. Most Americans probably don't even know if that had happened. Now, if Palestinians had killed 4 Israelis in the past week, that would have been headlines.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, if a nation's attacked, they have a right to defend themselves, but Israel's often criticized for this, what you brought up, the point of proportionality of its military responses. Could you talk about that, how this proportionality is a problem both under an international law and just morally?
That's right. And it's not just, again, the liberal media suggests, well, Israel was attacked and has the right to defend itself, but it disproportionately defends itself by killing mass, for example, in 2014 it killed something like 1,400 Palestinians, whereas Palestinians killed 9 Israelis. Those numbers are usually not given to Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So not only is it disproportionate, massively disproportionate, but if you actually look at the chronology, it's Israel that initiated the violence as well. Mm-hmm. We consider it sort of like any argument or dispute. You can sort of, let's say that I go and punch somebody, and then they punch me, but you only see them punching me. You don't see what preceded it. Mm-hmm. So that's what consistently happens with the U.S. coverage of this conflict, as it's called, or these wars, which is really a misnomer for such disproportionate deaths on both sides.
Right.
They consistently, I wrote an article several years ago about the LA Times, when they had one of those typical articles about violence shattered a period of calm. As they said, violence had just shattered a period of calm. In reality, during that period of time, let me get you the exact numbers for this, because it was really quite strong that during that period of calm, Israeli forces had killed 100 Palestinians during a period that the LA Times was calling a period of calm.
Mm. No.
So again, we're always hearing that supposedly Israel is defending itself, but in reality it is Israel that has initiated the violence.
Right. And of course, the 1967 war, Israel occupied these territories, Palestinian territories, and has not left. This is something that people don't understand. This is against international law. I've had Christian friends of mine saying, well, Israel won this territory fair and square in war. It's like, well, no, this is not the Bronze Age. You can't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. You're going to war with a country. You have to evacuate. Eventually, when the war is over, you have to evacuate your troops, and you can't just annex territory. And a lot of people just don't understand that. There are international laws about these things. So Israel continues to occupy territory in Palestine. There's the economic blockade of Gaza, which has ruined Gaza's economy and at times causing people to starve, not receive medical care and all that sort of thing. And so, yeah, when the people talk about relative calm, we're still, looking at an occupation, military occupation of Palestinian land.
That's right. A lot of people, I agree that people often fail to understand that, again, because of the media coverage. If we had good media coverage, this would be very clear. But it's against international law to acquire land by warfare. Mm-hmm. After we have the Geneva Conventions, there are the Hague Conventions before that, in the modern world, you're not allowed to just go and conquer somebody and take over their land and say, well, we conquered it, we get it.
Right.
So, we defeated Japan and Germany in World War II. We didn't take over Japan. We didn't take over Germany. We occupied both for a period of time. We then eventually left. So there's no precedent of being allowed to, from the American point of view, of just, we have the power. We could take over Canada, and that will now become part of the United States. That's just not permissible under international law.
Mm.
Also, people will sort of excuse Israel because they'll say, well, they were attacked, so they, that's what the Palestinians get because there's the illusion that Israel was attacked during the Six-Day War, that it was Palestinians, Egypt, Syria that initiated the war. But again, that's another falsehood that Israel was purveying during the war itself. Their ambassador to the U.S., Abba Eban, a very smooth speaker, told people that they had been attacked by Egypt. This was a complete lie. Within about a month or so, they actually no longer made that lie. But they were telling Americans they had been attacked and therefore they were defending themselves. In reality, Israel had initiated the attack. It had wiped out the Egyptian Air Force with the planes still on the ground. This is thoroughly documented, but most people don't know it. Some people now, what Israel claims is, well, it was a preemptive attack. Egypt was about to attack us, so it was a preemptive attack. That also is a falsehood. Again, you can look into it. Egypt was not about to attack. Some Israeli leaders have acknowledged that. What it was is Egypt was actually sending out peace feelers. And Israel didn't want peace because they felt this was an opportune time to take the rest of the Palestinian territories that they hadn't gotten before this time. And they therefore initiated the war, and they ended up getting the West Bank and Gaza.
Mm.
And as you say, they still occupy those today, especially the West Bank is clear occupation. Gaza, they withdrew their forces, but they control the external borders, so most people also consider that an occupation.
Mm.
And what also is important to know is that, you cannot occupy somebody for, half a century. That's just not permissible. But that's what Israel's doing. But if you are the occupying force, as we were in Japan, then you are responsible for the well-being of the civilian population under you. You're the authorities, you're in control of that population, therefore you're responsible for making sure that there's not violence done against those people.
Mm-hmm.
Israel's occupation is the opposite of that. They invade literally. If people go to our website, you'll see we have a link to an excellent news source from the region itself. Every day, literally, Israeli soldiers invade Palestinian villages in the West Bank, abduct various people, beat them, humiliate them, and every so often kill one or two. This is what goes on every day under the Israeli occupation.
Now you've traveled to the region. You've talked to mothers, fathers, children, leaders, doctors. Can you talk about the lives of the average Palestinians living in the occupied territories or Gaza, or even those living in Israel right now? What are their lives like on a daily basis?
Well, it varies a bit from location to location.
Mm-hmm.
In Gaza, as you mentioned, Gaza's been under siege for, I think it's about 13 years now. There's been a blockade of Gaza. This is, again, a violation of international law. So numerous organizations, including Christian Aid, the Red Cross, I believe Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, a number of, and some Israeli organizations, have documented how devastating this has been and is to Gazans living there. There's malnutrition among children, so that it's causing growth stunting. There's unemployment, I think it's about 50% or 60%. Medicines, vital, just normal medicines, are often in low supply. Israel, meanwhile, has invaded Gaza a number of times, so it destroyed thousands of Palestinian homes, and then they were unable to rebuild them because building supplies were being restricted. So the degree of suffering in Gaza is astronomical. When I was there in 2001, it was already large. Already there were Israeli forces were invading, they were shelling. I have pictures that show what it was like in Gaza before any rockets had been fired finally in response. And yet, bad as it was then, I remember, talking to a woman who was working at a hotel that was trying to operate, and it was almost empty, and she was the only one working for her entire extended family of 40 people. 40 people on one woman's small salary. I saw farmers whose farms, their orchards, their crops had been completely destroyed. This was early 2001. And I remember thinking, how does a farmer feed his family, feed his children, when his farm is destroyed? And this was already going on then. Since then, year by year by year, I've seen it getting worse and worse and worse. Now in the West Bank when I was there was also being shelled. I went around areas that were literally being shelled by Israeli F-16s, I believe they were, helicopter gunships. Israeli forces were invading. Children were being shot. I was in the home of a 9-year-old boy who'd been shot and killed by Israeli forces. So that population is they're not starving the way people in Gaza are, but they're at continual risk of violence. And they are also living in little prisons within larger prisons, is the way I put it, because people probably picture the West Bank as Palestinian territory, which it is. However, in reality, Israeli forces and Israeli settlements are scattered throughout the West Bank. So if you try to go to work or go to school or go to visit your grandmother or your children in the next village over, often you cannot get there because there are Israeli checkpoints in between. And checkpoints aren't toll booths. These are armed Israeli soldiers with machine guns preventing movement within the Palestinian territories themselves. So, sometimes you can't go to work, you can't go to school, you can't visit your family member, you can't get to a hospital. In the number of cases, women needing to get to a hospital to deliver their baby are prevented from doing that, and the baby dies. Sometimes the women themselves have died. Again, this is all documented. People can research this and learn these facts themselves. Mm-hmm. But I was there and I saw what was going on. Also, if they are allowed to go through these checkpoints, often there's humiliation. People are sometimes strip searched, including women, sometimes even children. I've heard those stories a lot. I talked to some Palestinian Christians who were trying to get from Bethlehem to Jerusalem at Easter time for an Easter egg hunt, and their daughter was forced to take off her clothing. It's horrendous what's going on. At the same time, they've been living under this occupation for these decades, since 1967, and they still try to live normal lives. They still have celebrations, they still have weddings, they still, manage to have happy times, they still try to have businesses. So, there's sort of semi-normal life going on under extremely abnormal conditions. Mm. Palestinians in Israel are considered third-class citizens because Israelis who are from Arab countries that are ethnically Arab are often second-class citizens. Third-class citizens are the Palestinian Israelis who supposedly are Israelis, but their schools are underfunded, they're discriminated against, there are places they're not allowed to live because the kind of restrictive covenants our country used to have against Jews, shamefully. Mm-hmm. This goes on openly in Israel against Palestinian Christians and Muslims. So they're discriminated against. They're Their children are mistreated. They don't have full rights. That also is largely unknown by Americans.
Do you feel that the U.S. has any credibility as a peace broker, especially since we tend to be so one-sided in this conflict? We've been a peace broker for generations. Usually a peace broker is someone who's a neutral party. Are we really neutral, and do we have any legitimacy? Would it be better if someone else took over the peace process?
I think it would be much better. The rest of the world, especially the Middle East, are very aware that our country, our politics, our diplomatic actions, we on behalf of Israel, the U.S. has vetoed a number of international efforts to stop Israeli violence and to bring peace, and we end up vetoing them. So the rest of the world knows that we have not acted as a neutral broker at all. And an American who was part of the process even admitted at some point that we had been, he said, the U.S. in these supposed negotiations, the U.S. had really acted as Israel's attorney, that we were acting on behalf of Israel. So no, we're incorrectly perceived as not a neutral broker, and a neutral broker is required. I do feel that peace can be found there, but not while the U.S. is shielding Israel from the consequences of what it's doing. Not as long as we give Israel unlimited money and weaponry, so that militarists in Israel think we can do whatever we want. We don't have to compromise at all. And even though there is a portion of the Israeli citizenry who have long wanted to compromise, there is a peace movement in Israel, but they're undermined by the U.S. governmental actions that just basically show Israel, no matter what you do, we'll give you money. Just a few days ago, right during this time, right after Human Rights Watch had found that Israel had committed war crimes against Gaza in May, while Israeli forces had killed an 11-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 20-year-old. Right during that time, our Democratic Congress members voted to give Israel $3 billion of U.S. tax money. $3 billion of U.S. tax money, passed by Democrats. Supposedly, many of us thought the progressive, peace portion of the political spectrum. So, and yet most of us don't know that happened because the U.S. media didn't even cover the fact that that was passed by the full House of Representatives and is now going to the Senate. And not only was it $3 billion, there's another approximately $3 billion on projects that are being funded on behalf of Israel. The Israel Lobby writes about this quite openly. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, issued a press release. They were celebrating the passage of this, and they pointed out that this additional money was also, quote, relevant to Israel, in other words, good for Israel. That's why it was passed. So when you add up all of that, if this is passed by the Senate and signed into law, as is probable, another bill would give them another $500 million. There's no doubt that also will go through. In the end, it will be $20 million per day of Americans' tax money on behalf of Israel. Half of it directly to Israel, half of it on projects and items that benefit Israel. And yet most Americans have no idea about this because the media doesn't report on it.
What do you think can the average American who's maybe listening to this broadcast and alarmed at what they're learning, what do you feel like they can do on a daily basis to help be part of the solution instead of part of the problem?
That's right. Thank you. That's the most important question, of course. I feel there are two things we can and must do. I feel morality requires it, and even self-interest requires it in this case. We need to, first of all, share this information with other people. You'll be called names. That's a sad reality that will happen no matter how you say it, that will happen. But share factual, fair information with others. Don't be afraid to do that. Tell people about this. We all need to tell everyone what's going on. And also then contact your elected representatives in Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the President. Day after day after day, contact them and say, I don't want my tax money used in the way it's being used. It's preventing peace. It's enabling an escalation of violence. Don't use my tax money this way. If we do those two things, I think we will save massive numbers of lives. We will save Palestinian lives. We'll save Israeli lives. The next war that will come, Israel partisans want us now to attack Iran. That will be a massive loss of life if we do that. We're already attacking Iran financially, which is improper. If we have the courage and the principle to speak up factually and fairly about this issue, and to tell our elected representatives time after time, we can stop this. I feel strongly the American population can stop what's going on if we'll do those two things.
Mm-hmm. Sustained political pressure.
That's right. And I always like to point out when I'm doing this. The pro-Israel organizations, the ADL, AIPAC, the Jewish federations, the Jewish Community Relations Councils, all of these groups advocate for Israel. They try to claim that they represent all Jewish Americans, but they do not. So I always like to point out that there are many Jewish Americans who have long been opposing these policies and have long been opposing Israeli violence, that this is something we all can and should do.
We'll end with this. This recent crisis that erupted in May. Do you feel that there was something different about that in terms of how the media covered it? I just, noticed there was a little bit more criticism this time of Israel, a little bit more as if, people were just feeling, enough is enough. I don't know if you felt the same thing, but I felt like the tide was beginning to turn, or maybe it's just temporary. But how did you feel about the coverage?
I think I completely agree with you. I think it was a little more factual, that people saw a little bit more what was actually being done to Gaza. The fact that Israeli forces killed 253 Gazans, and Gazans killed 12 people in Israel was more visible to people than previous such conflicts. I think that was a good thing. I mean, it's a little bit because among the movement for Israel, some want Israel to be less blatant, so sometimes that's what accounts for the different views of it. But I do think the coverage was a little bit more open, and more people were saying, what, they're doing this again? This is going too far. And I think that's starting to come through a little bit in the liberal media. I'm not sure that was the case, sadly, with Fox News. And Fox News is not always bad on some issues. I think that they're reporting important things. But on this issue, that's just not the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, Allison Weir, thank you so much for being with us and talking about these issues. Allison Weir is a freelance journalist and a founder of If Americans Knew. If you get a chance, please check out the organization's website for some really fascinating, interesting, informative data, information, facts about this conflict. And that website will be available on our show website as well. Thank you again for being with us, and God bless you in your work.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your program.
And this is S.J. Munson signing off.